So before we get into breeding, pairing, and how alleles work together, I wanted to take a quick moment to discuss the E locus. So as I said in the first video, the E locus is primarily made up of the full extension and the non-extension, but it does also have these two incomplete genes as well. So in order of most dominant to most recessive, we're going to have this incomplete gene here. This is the steal. Then we're going to have full extension, harlequin, and non-extension. So let's take a look at what these do. So steal, it pushes the color up to the tip of the hair shaft. In order for steal to actually show, the rabbit does need to be agouti because it is pushing those agouti rings up to the top of the hair shaft. And what that does is it leaves you a darker undercoat that has tips of either gold or silver. That color, the gold or silver, is going to be dependent on the C locus. If you have a rabbit with full color, that means all of the yellow is still in the coat, you'll have a gold tip steal. And if you have a steal that has chinchilla on the C locus, that's chinchilla dark, no yellow, you will have a silver tip steal. Next we have full extension. That's where all of the color fully extends all the way up the hair shaft. Followed by harlequin, and that segregates the color into like a brindling pattern. And again, this is going to be dependent on the C locus as well for the color that you get. A Japanese harlequin will be splotches of black and orange, whereas a magpie, if it has the chinchilla dark, so no yellow, will be splotches of black and white. And then finally, we come down here to non-extension. And the most notable that people mostly recognize is tort for non-extension, but all of these colors also depend on having non-extension in order to get them. So when you have a self rabbit, so that's two recessive A's on the A locus, you'll have a tort. But if you have agouti in that, you'll have your orange, cream, fawn, red. These colors can also depend on the C locus, so something like your ermine is going to be that agouti, but also with a chinchilla dark, so that's going to produce your ermine. And then you can come down here if you have that tan pattern, that lowercase a with a T, that's going to give you like your fox. So as I mentioned, these two genes have what is called incomplete dominance. So what does that mean? It means that these don't fully erase out the other gene when they're paired together. So let's take a look at how that looks. So the steal gene, ES, is going to be the most dominant in this series. So when it is paired with a full extension, that's when you get a properly colored steal. When you have the steal paired with non-extension, it's going to create a much more poor coloring if the rabbit is agouti, because remember, this requires the rabbit to be agouti for it to show. So if you have a self rabbit that's non-extension, like a tort, it's not going to show. It's going to be hidden. And this is where things get interesting, because if you notice, this capital E indicates that this is a dominant gene, whereas this indicates it is a more recessive gene. However, if you were to pair the ES with EJ here, you're going to get patches of black with patches of steal. So overall, it's going to be a darker colored rabbit because in the areas that would normally be orange on here, it's now going to be steal colored. So all of that orange coloring is going to be pushed to the top of the hair shaft. And you'll have a darker color underneath. Now, where things get even more interesting is if you have steal paired with steal. You'll get what's called a super steal. And a super steal is going to look like a normal self-colored rabbit. That's because when steal is paired with itself, like I said, steal pushes the color upwards towards the tip of the hair shaft. When it's a super steal paired together, it pushes the color pretty much off the hair shaft. So your super steal is going to look like a normal self-colored rabbit. However, it's not going to be self-colored. So if you have a self-colored rabbit that is throwing agouti or that is throwing steal, you don't have a self-colored rabbit. You have an agouti rabbit with super steal. Now, as I mentioned, steal can hide. It cannot be carried. It is the most dominant. So it can't be carried under one of these genes, but it can hide. So any rabbit that has self, so that AA on the A locus, any rabbit that is self-colored will hide steal because self is not going to show steal. Any rabbit that is tan, now I've heard conflicting things about this, but any rabbit with a tan pattern, the two things that I've heard is that a tan will have ticking, very slight ticking, only in areas of the tan pattern, so around the eyes and things like that, or it will be completely hidden. So there are 3 different ways that steal can hide in your lines. And this is one of the reasons that you want to be careful when you are breeding steal into anything. So next, let's look at Harlequin. And Harlequin is that brindling pattern. So a properly colored Harlequin is going to be EJ, EJ. So 2 Harlequin alleles on the E locus. Ideally, this would also be a agouti rabbit as well. However, if you have an EJE, that's going to give you a torted Harlequin. So tort needs to be self-colored in order for it to appear on the rabbit. So if you have a tort rabbit, so self AA with non-extension, but it has the more dominant Harlequin, you will end up with what's called a torted Harlequin. This is a poorly colored Harlequin. If it is a EJE with agouti on the A locus, this will not show up. But if it is self-colored with non-extension and Harlequin, you will get a torted Harlequin. And then also, I just want to point this out, EJ, the Harlequin gene, plus the broken gene is going to give you a tricolored rabbit. This is a rabbit that looks kind of like a calico cat. So to recap this, the E locus is primarily the full extension and the non-extension, but it does also have these 2 incomplete genes. So the steal, which is the most dominant, and the Harlequin. Steal has a number of ways that it can be hidden. Harlequin, while it is more recessive, there are certain ways that it can show up and certain ways that it can show up wrong. The E locus is very heavily dependent on the A locus as well. So depending on what's on your A locus is going to kind of dictate what you're going to get on your E locus. And then the C locus will greatly impact your E locus as well. So I hope this makes sense. And now after this, we're going to get into the pairing and how alleles are distributed